Okay, we're starting Siman Shin Samach Vav. We'll talk a few topics that are relevant to Siman Shin Samach Vav. The way it applies to Lamaisa. Siman Shin Samach Vav is the first Siman in Hilchos Ceirovin, Ceirovei Chatzeres. Up until now, from Shin Mem Hey through Shin Samach Hey was all Hilchos Reshuyos, defining the different Reshuyos that are applicable, Reshus Rabim, Reshus Yachid, Karmelis, Mokim Ptur, and how to convert, how to close off certain Reshuyos, certain properties, whether it's a Chatzar, whether it's a Mavoi, etc., etc. All that was discussed in the סימן that we learned until now, through Shin Mem Hey, through Shin Samach Hey, and the definition of each one of them. Question is right now, once you already have a closed area, how do you, when are you allowed to carry? So obviously if you have a closed area and it's only your property, so it's a complete Reshus Yachid, and there is no problem to carry in that Reshus Yachid. However, if that property is not only yours, but it is a partnership, or it's owned by more than one person, then there is, even though Midiraisa you are allowed to carry because it's Reshus Yachid, there's a difference when you're talking about Reshuyos. There is you have to recognize the difference between that when we talk about Reshus Rabim, the translation of Reshus Rabim is an area that's publicly used. But when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, the difference in Reshus Rabim and Reshus Yachid is not only based on the usage of people, but it also has the element of mechitzas. So once there's mechitzas, once there's tikkunim, once something is done to change its status, it changes status also, but it doesn't allow you to carry. Midiraisa it does. Midirabanan, the Chachamim were geyser that when you have a Reshus Yachid Gemura Midiraisa, that inside of it has more than one owner, more than one person, more than one unit of residence in that property, you have to make a Ceirouv. The word Ceirouv does not mean the string, although that's what people refer to it. The word Ceirouv means mixing. It refers to mixing everybody, the people who are partners in this property all mix their food together, and therefore they become all, as if they're all based out of the same, eating the same food, and therefore they are all considered as one unit for the purpose of carrying from one to another. Because now each person has in this Ceirouv, in this mixture of food, he has some of his food over there, so he's able to carry to and from within that property. That is when it comes to Chatzeres. This is talking about a single property, closed property, a Chatzar, which has in it different units, which not the classical Chatzar that is talking about, where it has one general area and it has two houses or more. What you look at it is usually a bungalow colony, for example, is a good example of it, or an apartment building. An apartment building is essentially a chatzar, because it has just a question on the apartment building is who owns the general areas. That's a different discussion. When we talk about Lamashal, a simple one, the condos, where each person is the owner of each one has a schus in the general area, it's the same thing as a chatzar. And that is when you have to make a Ceirouvi Chatzeres, and that is what the halachas that start from now, Shin Samach Vav going weiter, is what it discusses. That is Gzeres Chachamim, that you have to carry in it. Why is that? So people should not get used to carrying in a place where it's aser. Not only that, the same Chachamim added even a further Gzera, a siag, that you cannot carry from a Reshus Yachid to a Reshus Yachid when you're not crossing the Chatzar. If you have two Reshus Yachids that are completely connected and there's no Chatzar between them, still you have to put still you're not allowed to carry, because of a common word you might carry from a Reshus Yachid to Reshus Rabim. That is concept of Ceirouvi Chatzeres when it comes to a singular Chatzar. When you have more than one chatzar and they are touching each other, you want to carry from one chatzar to the other chatzar and they have a doorway between them, then they have to make a Ceirouv that connects the two together, and that is a whole discussion whether when they could make, sometimes they have to make, each one has to make its independent Ceirouv and then they have to make an Ceirouv between them together. Sometimes they make an Ceirouv, one Ceirouv that covers both together. The same idea also is going to be discussed later in Siman Shin Pei Zayin, when it comes to the concept of shitufei mavoyos, when you have one mavoy that comes to another mavoy, it also has that idea, so that expands it from chatzeros to mavoyos and connecting mavoyos and the shitufim in the own mavoy by itself, which a mavoy is a collection of chatzeros, and then from one mavoy to another mavoy, and from that you go to the much bigger one of making an Ceiruv, making Ceiruv when it refers to a city, which the question is, which category does it fall into? There is differences between Ceiruv Chatzeros and Shitufei Mevoyos, where it's supposed to be placed, etc., which that's going to be discussed from one to another. Now, where do you put the Ceiruv Chatzeros? When do you have to put the Ceiruv Chatzeros? When are you obligated to do a Ceiruv Chatzeros? Is when the Chatzer is a permanent location where people are there. The Lashon of the Alter Rebbe ve'oimet sham yomim, that he's referring to if there's a camping place where they make a gate around the tents because they stopped in the middle of travel. If it's oimet sham yomim, if it's there semi-permanent, that already needs a Ceiruv Chatzeros. Obviously, if people live in a building, they for sure need a Ceiruv Chatzeros. But the exception would be if people just made a place they're traveling and they only stopped for Shabbos. Over there, for one day, over there, you don't have to make an Ceiruv between them. That means you don't have to do this mix of food, but you still have to close off the area. Obviously, so what it means is if you're traveling and you stop in a place which has a gated area and everybody is there, and each person has their own tent in this gated area, it's already closed off as a reshus. You don't have to make a own Ceiruv Chatzeros within the people that are in there. Now, if there is people who are guests or something like that to eat from the same thing, that's a whole different discussion. It's going to be discussed later in Shin Ayin, etc. When that is a whole different question. And from that it also applies to hotels, hospitals, and things like that. And there's a letter from the Rebbe where he gives the 5 reasons why you don't have to make a Ceiruv Chatzeros in a hotel. Now, when there are houses in a ship, there's certain times that you do have to make an Ceiruv Chatzeros, and that's also discussed in Shulchan Aruch, which when you are supposed to, when you're not supposed to. You have to realize the realities of today are different. When we discuss it, you have to apply it. Batum Shebasfina does not refer to a cruise. A cruise is not Batum Shebasfina. A cruise is similar to a hotel. It has a din similar to a din of a hotel, which is again not relevant to Siman Shin Samachlo, but more relevant to Siman Shin Ayin. Who is the one that gives? The original idea of a Ceiruv was that everybody would give together a bread, or they would give flour and they would make a bread out of it. It would be put into one container, and that would be the Ceiruv. It would all get mixed. It would all get mixed together. The person who has the Ceiruv in his house, the Ceiruv bread does not have to donate towards the Ceiruv. And it points out, the Shulchan Aruch already points out, you cannot use a goy to be the one sending around to collect from everybody. For a simple reason, you need somebody that you can trust. A goy has no ne'emanos, and therefore if somebody who has no ne'emanos is considered a goy who has no ne'emanos for this purpose, if he is going to be the one collecting, you can't be sure that he's going to collect from every single person, and you might end up with a problem that you might not have an Ceiruv from every single person in this Chatzer. There is a totally different element which we're not discussing now, it's later on in Shulchan Aruch, when somebody could be mevatel, when somebody could be prevent the other people from having an Ceiruv in their property. It's also not discussed in this Siman, but it's going to be discussed later on. It's relevant if you have a place where some of the people are not interested in participating, how does that affect everything? Or if you have Goyim and you have Yidden sharing in the same property, but again, that's not in this Siman. Now, where could the Eruv be placed? The Eruv Chatzeros has to be placed in a house, in a residence, a place which is fit for living. Alter Rebbe points out to you, and this is that it has to be Daled al Daled, and even if it's a long place which does not have Daled width, even if it's much longer, it does not work to be able to put the Eruv in that place, because it's not a Mokim Haroi Ladira. It's not a place which is fit for a residence. The examples that are given over there are some places which might be closed off, like a base shar, etc., but it's not so relevant to it. The places where you get these halachas, which, if you want to understand better the halachas that are discussed over here when it comes to what's considered a base dira or not, you will be better off if you also learn Hilchos Mezuzah, where all these things are also discussed. And I think that one or two places over here in the footnotes, the Alter Rebbe does send you to Hilchos Mezuzah in Yeridea to discuss some of the topics that are connected to this idea. The minhag of the Jews is to put it, the Ashkenazi Jews, is to put the Eruv in the shul, Beis HaKnesses. That was a long and big fight between the poskim about how to deal with this specific issue of having an Eruv in a Beis HaKnesses, because a Beis HaKnesses is not a place for residence. Then it became issues whether a place, if you really want to understand, well understand this topic of it, there is in the back of your Tur Shulchan Aruch, in the Yalkut, the Kovetz Mefarshim, there is the Yalkut Mefarshim, in the beginning of Siman Shin Samach Vav, you have about 3 pages, the Eshel Avram, who he goes through all the shittas, the whole discussion of it, which that is, obviously once you learn the Shulchan Aruch and you learn the Magen Avram, and the Pri Megadim, each one of them is a little bit, I'm going to mention them later, but then you have this Eshel Avram, which goes through a good few columns in a row of the whole, everything that was discussed. There was a whole, the tshuva from the Chacham Tzvi, a very sharp tshuva, whether it could work, whether it can't work. This goes back many years already to the time of the Magen Avram, brings the Maril and the Shibbolei Aleket, etc., when it comes to the relevance of if you can make an Eruv in a Beis HaKnesses, because it's not a place where you live, at the same time as a place that everybody uses, and how to deal with it. The Alter Rebbe mentioned that the minhag is, this is a quote from the Ramah, pretty much a quote from the Ramah, the minhag is to put the Eruv in the Beis HaKnesses, even though it's not a Beis Dire, it's not a place where you live, and even though it's not Roi L'Dire, and even though you're not allowed to eat in the Beis HaKnesses unless you are learning there. And the reason that is given, the Alter Rebbe brings the reason, says, Nosnu Tam L'Minhag Zeh, who's the Nosnu Tam, is talking about the Ramah, that today's Eruv Chatzeros that we're doing is not really Eruv Chatzeros, which needs all the conditions of Eruv Chatzeros, that it has to be in a Beis Dira, but rather it is Midin Shituf Mevoyos, and Shituf Mevoyos, you do not need it to be in a Beis Dira, rather you just need it in Mokim HaMishtamer, in a place where it's protected, and therefore if we consider today's Eiruvin and a shul like Shituf Mevoyos rather than Eruv Chatzeros, then you don't have to worry about the idea of whether it's in a place. Why do you need it in a Mokim HaMishtamer? And why is a shul a good place? If you look, and now we'll compare it to Shituf Mevoyos, you look in Siman Shin Pei Zayin, where on the beginning when Alter Rebbe discusses Shituf Mevoyos, and over there, where the Alter Rebbe over there discusses it, he says that obviously when you do Shituf Mevoyos, you still have to do Eruv Chatzeros for each of the Chatzeros that are open to in this Mavoy, and the reason for it is that the kids should not forget the whole idea of an Eruv, and Alter Rebbe says, and therefore the minhag is to hang it in the shul, because that is a public place. So the kids will see it hanging, and they will know the concept of an Eruv, and that you cannot just carry wherever you want, but rather there has to be something done on Shabbos to allow you to carry. It has to be a public, visible display that reminds you carrying is not allowed, but there are ways to, if it's done right, you could do it. Now, if a mavoi does not have, if a mavoi was not yet converted to a mavoi, which you could do shituf mavoyos in it, because to do shituf mavoyos, a mavoi has to have what we learned. You can't start from shituf mavoyos. You have to first make the mavoi a mavoi where you could make a shituf mavoyos, which means you have to do the tikkun with a lechet, so sapesach, or whatever else is needed for that. So if you have a mavoyos or not mesuken, or the shul is in a mavoi which was not mesuken, and therefore you cannot put the Eruv in the shul, because then it's not going to help you anything. You're not going to be able to carry to and from the shul. You could still carry within the shul, or from the shul to the chatzar of the shul, which is obviously closed. I don't have to remind you every time, but it's obviously the chatzar of the shul is closed in the shus. If the chatzar of the shul is only for the shul, or it has one more residence over there. Obviously, if it has more than one residence over there, it becomes a chatzar where the residents themselves have to make a Eruv between them. So if you can't put an Eruv because there's no proper mavayos, you can still carry within the shul or the chatzar of the shul. And every single resident of the city who is considered this shul, they're all considered as archim, and nobody prevents anybody else from being able to carry in it. Nobody could say, we have to make an Eruv chatzeros within the shul to be able to carry inside the shul. That's how the Alter Rebbe paskins here. In Shulchan Aruch. Yeah.
The Rosh Hashanah to discuss whether today he sees the minig also as the chatzeros in the shul, or today
they don't do it anymore. Now, we're going to get to this now. You just have to understand, today's shuls are not the Bati Knesios that were in the past. The Bati Knesios in the past were you only daven in the shul, but some Bati Knesios had places in the shul where guests would come for Shabbos and they would eat and they would sleep over there, so it would create an issue. What is the definition of these people? Do they mess it up for the rest of the city townspeople of it? That's first point. Now, this whole discussion whether a shul, Beis HaKnesses, is a place that you could carry in it or not, is discussed in the Mogen Avram and Sivkot and Yud. Over there, he brings that. Right away, starts by saying that because the shul is not a Beis Dire, therefore you could carry in the whole area. It's considered as one shusayach, and everybody is guests of it. Nobody has ownership. The idea is nobody has ownership of this specific shul, and therefore it's not a base. You could carry in the whole shul by itself. And there, in the Mogen Avram right away asks, and therefore he doesn't understand why the Maharil say you're not allowed to carry in a shul. Then the Mogen Avram continues and says, and if you look in the Shibbolei Aleket says that a shul which has people do not live over there. It means it's a community shul, but nobody lives in the shul. Or even if it was built by a private person, and even if it's a private person, you don't have to make an Eruv to be able to carry in the shul. However, if guests are in the shul and they're eating and they're sleeping in the shul, they have to make an Eruv over there. And the Shibbolei Aleket continues, and that it's not a problem. The Urchim do not, even if they, for them, maybe they need to do a Eruv for themselves, but they're still not Oyser on the rest of Bnei Ha'ir if they did not do an Eruv. The Pri Megadim right away explains what it's talking about over here. First he says, why is a shul like that? He says a Beis HaKnesses is considered a Chatzar HaShutfim, a partnership of everybody who lives in the town. And therefore you could carry from the shul, you carry in the shul, you carry from the shul to a chatzar, because it's all considered one big chatzar. And yeah, but it's everybody's there together and everybody's considered, so to speak, archim of the same location, and therefore in this area they are all allowed to carry. It's not a Beis Dire. And he says, what's talking about when the Mogen Avram says, the Shibbolei Aleket says about a shul which was B'no Yachid, it's obviously talking about that he built it himself, but he dedicated it to the community, and that's how it belongs to everybody else. And the implication is that if somebody builds his own private shul, it might even be easier if he just hosts the people in his shul, then they're definitely orchim, and you don't even have to have a discussion whether you need an Eruv or not, because it remains private. There is a Even HaOizer, which is mentioned in Even HaOizer, which discusses today's shul. We're going to get to it in a second, and that is, but before we're going to get to something else. In Siddur, with Alter Rebbe, in Seder Eiruvi Chatzeros, the Alter Rebbe has a line which says as follows: "V'lo yasu Eiruv Chatzeros be'erev Pesach, Elohim ken yesh beis batim bechatzer beis hakneses, sheyutru al yedei Eiruv zeh letaltel ulehavi ha'eiruv mizeh lozeh." So Alter Rebbe writes in Eiruv Chatzeros, which implies a few interesting points. First of all, yeah, when do you do the Eruv Chatzeros? You obviously do it in Erev Pesach. It says, in Oisim Eruv Chatzeros be'erev Pesach, lo yas Eruv Chatzeros be'erev Pesach, Elohim kein. And then we're going to soon see why it's done specifically in Erev Pesach. Number two is, it's obviously that they would do it in the shul, because it's talking about b'chatzar beis hakneses. Number three, that it doesn't help in a shul unless that to leave a Eruv in a shul doesn't help unless the shul is connected, or it has two houses which are going to be able to use this Eruv for themselves, which is something which you already saw in Samachay. That if the only way a Eruv Chatzeros works in the shul is when the shul has a purpose. The Eruv in the shul serves a purpose for two people to be able to carry it. So if you have a shul is not in a chatzar, it's not connected to the chatzar, you cannot do a Eruv Chatzeros over there, because you're not going to achieve anything. If people are living in a different area and they cannot carry to or from the shul area because it's not connected or because it didn't do the shiduf, then the Eruv Chatzeros will serve absolutely no purpose, and you cannot do it. And you cannot do it in the shul. Now, I did mention the Even HaOizer, and if you look in your white book, there is at the end of it. I brought tshuvas from the Sha'arei Deya. Sha'arei Deya was Lubavitch Chavod. The book was printed by Ahal Shem. It's a very famous book of tshuvas. All the way by the end of the book, in page 177, which is Shas Tshuvas Siman Lamed Daled, short tshuva, which was talking about, it was asked in the city of Bahosh, that the shaila was that the city does not have shitufim avayis, and you cannot carry in the city because they didn't take care of it. Also, there is no Eruv Chatzeros. They didn't do Eruv Chatzeros. So what is there? There is a shul. The shul is sitting in the big property. The shul is the beis hakneses in the center, and the property that's where the shul sits has smaller batei midrashes in the big property, on the corners of it, in the areas around it. Yeah, he says in front of the shul. He says that you have the beis hakneses, and in front of the beis hakneses you have a chatzar. Not around it. In front of it you have a chatzar, and in the chatzar you have four batei midrashes, one in each corner. And there's a lot of openings to that chatzar, and people go from that chatzar to their own chatzeros, and from that chatzar to the shul, etc., etc. And the people are noyig to be metaltal back and forth over there. And he says, the Rav HaShoyel, the one who asked the question, says that he thinks that this chatzar that's in front of the shul, should be considered a reshus harabim. Why? Because when you look in the Gemara regarding Tumah, the reshus of the Azara, it's considered a reshus harabim. So So the Shari Deir responds to him, he says, you cannot compare the din of Rishus Harabim for Tumah to the din of Rishus Harabim for Shabbos, because Rishus Harabim for Shabbos has to do with mechitzas, not with the definition of Tumah. That's the first point. Next point, he says, Bechlal, since we're discussing carrying in a shul, we have the Magen Avram who brings the different shittas, whether you could carry or you can't carry inside a shul, which is very interesting how he points it out, because if you read the Magen Avram simply, it seems like the Magen Avram paskins that you are allowed to. That's a simple reading. The Magen Avram starts by saying that you're allowed to, and he ends by saying pretty much that you're allowed to, and in the middle he brings the shitta of the Trumas Hadeshin that you're not allowed to. But the way the Sharadei understood it, he presents it that the Magen Avram just brings Machlokes HaPoskim. It's not Machriya, that's what it looks like. So he says, that's first point. You have a question if you bechlal carry in a shul. More so, you have Even HaOizer. The Even HaOizer, which you're going to see if you look through the Yalkut Mefarshim, you're going to see it over there at length. It's quoted in the Eish Avram. That over there, the Even HaOizer says that in today's day and age, shuls are not the community shuls that there used to be, that everything belongs to everyone. Rather, each person owns his seat. It becomes his own property. Mekoimes knuyim liyachidim. Each person owns a seat, and therefore each person could be oiser. He is oiser on the other person unless there is a Erev Chatzeres done between them. And obviously that you cannot carry from the shul to the Chatzer for that reason, from the Chatzer to the shul without a Erev. That's what the Even HaOizer points out. So now what happens is in such a scenario, when you don't have an Erev in the city, there's no shit of Mevayos in the city, and there's no Eruv Chatzeres in the city. So you don't have an Eruv that surrounds the shul and that connects the people who each one owns a seat into the shul. So you can't just make an Eruv in the shul. Yeah? Why can't you make an Eruv in the shul? Because the shul is not a base dira. If the shul is not a base dira, the fact that everybody owns over there, so it's a problem on both ends. They become oiser one on another because each one owns their own seat. And at the same time, you cannot make an Eruv over there because it's not a base dira. The only way it will become a base dira is if people eat and sleep there. And he says, you're talking about people eating and sleeping there? We have a different problem. Then you cannot make a bracha. Safek on the bracha. Why is that a safek on the bracha? We're not sure if you can make a bracha over there. He says, not sure if you could make a bracha on such a thing. And he points over there in parentheses. I remember, he says, Churani Me'el Dusi. I remember when I was a kid, there was a Gadol Echad who was not happy with people, with people who made a bracha on Erev Chatzeres that they used for Sukkot, the Shabbos of Sukkot, to be able to carry, because that was not enough to be able to make a bracha. Therefore, the whole bracha is in a suffix. So he says, according to the Even HaOizer, it's clear, it's obvious that they're not allowed to carry in this property, in the shul, from the chatzar in front of the shul to the shul, or even within the shul. That's not a question, b'chlal. Why? Because it's a dira. The way the understanding of the Even HaOizer is that a dira, even without a bias, that means the fact that it's a place that people have ownership in it and they use it, even though it's not a house, each person could be oiser on the other person. So therefore, they can't carry into shul. And therefore, he concludes that Lemaise, he says, I can't think of any way how they could be able to carry from the shul to the chatzar, from the chatzar to the shul in such a scenario. And therefore, that the Rav should make sure to make a mechai on this action, that people should not be walking around carrying from the shul to there, from there to shul. Why? Because you don't have the shitufei mevayis in place.
The shul itself?
In the shul itself also is a problem.
The third is it's being double on the Even HaOizer for 2 times. First of all, he says that the seats are considered a mocking deer, but the seats first don't have the shear, according to him, that they own a tail and place a medish, so that's mocking deer, but it doesn't have amas. They don't eat there, they don't sleep there, and besides that, or because they bought a seat for Shani and Kippur for the whole year, that doesn't make them any violence on the karka underneath the chair. He doesn't even have violence on the chair. He has the right of the stampship.
Right, but he doesn't look at the Even Oizer. Seems like the way the understanding of the Even Oizer is that he doesn't require all these to make to be oiser one and another. He says that the amount that you need to be able to be oiser from one to another is not that high of a, you don't have to hit such a high bar. It's enough if there's already ownership, if each person has ownership over there and he's already enough to do it, as opposed to the simple understanding of the Magen Avraham and the Mechaber and the Alter Rebbe, that none of them mention this idea bichlal, that it's just the mere fact that the shul is not a base dira, the fact that everybody's using it does not make it a makom ha'asur. That means it doesn't seem like the simple reading of it will fit with the Even Ha'ozer.
And one more is that the base of medrash is manenu.
Today we don't do it in the shul anyways, usually.
Yeah.
We don't put it in the shul.
And the shuls today, everybody, it's all Tanai. They're making them all Tanai. You should be able to mishtamsh it for your tzrachem, especially the mitzvah. So that's why everybody can eat shalom shudas in the base of medrash.
Yeah.
Or take a snack. People, if they don't like the Rav Dasha, they close off. So it's a fucking machine too.
Yeah.
And basically, it is a makom deal.
So if it's a mokim dira, it's a bigger problem then.
Yeah,
It becomes a bigger problem. But still, we do carry in shuls. Today, the shuls, even we look at them, all the shuls today. Almost every shul, most shuls are owned by specific people rather than by the congregation. Even if they do own together, if they do eat together, then you have the heter that since they're eating together, they all become like one. So it's not a problem for Eruv. And let's continue. So the Eruv now, the next point is the Eruv, if it's in a specific house, you don't change it, even if the person dies and his Yarsha move into there, or if the person sells the house. Why is that? Because people know that the Eruv is sitting in this specific location. If you're going to change the location of the Eruv, people are going to start talking Lashon Hara. Why was the Eruv changed over there? Maybe this guy was stealing it. Maybe this guy is not this. Maybe this guy is that. So to prevent all that issues, we keep the Eruv in the house where it was done always. Yeah, that obviously this does not really apply in an apartment building when people change, unless you're permanent, but if it's every year people changing the apartments, you don't have to worry about it. Whoever's taking care of the Eruv Chatzeris could take care of it anyways. In Sif Yud, Alter Rebbe discusses from what you do the Eruv. And the Alter Rebbe concludes that the minhag today is that you do it on Erev Pesach, you do it with matzah, and you do it for the whole year. What's the reason for it? Simple, practical reason. Matzahs are not going to go bad, they're not going to grow mold, they're not going to rot, they're not going to turn green, and all the other things. So therefore, if you have as opposed to bread, so if you have a matzah, you know you're safe from Erev Pesach until the next year, Erev Pesach. And the other reason is because that's the only thing that you could do, you could actually, the Shabbos and Pesach also, you want to be able to carry then also. That's the only way you're going to be doing it, is if you have something which you're able to use on Pesach, and that the only thing is matzah. Now, every year, that is replaced. That is the minhag. It's not written on Alter Rebbe, but the minhag is replaced every year in Erev Pesach. The reason, or right before Pesach, the reason it's explained that, I think the Rebbe explains it, that we are choishesh mitzat chashash chametz, that you did not, the whole year this matzah was floating around your house, or it was in a specific place, and you were not careful that it should be protected from chametz, and therefore we have a chashash that maybe this matzah is something which has to be destroyed on Erev Pesach, so therefore we replace it every year. Now, the idea of Eruv is something that you are able to eat. What are you going to do when you make a Eruv Chatzeres on Erev Pesach? Shabbos HaGodol comes. You're going to make an Eruv Chatzeres, if it's a day between Shabbos HaGodol and Erev Pesach, you're going to do it after Shabbos HaGodol, or before Shabbos HaGodol, whatever it is. You can't eat the matzah, because we have the minhag that we don't eat matzah for 30 days before Pesach. So there are two kavim in it. Lubavitch Rabbanim will tell you two different ways. There are those, I think Rabbi Ashkenazi from Kfar Chabad will tell people to cook it on after Shabbos HaGodol, or to make the new, you can't eat the regular matzah, to make the new matzah right before Shabbos HaGodol, and then on Shabbos HaGodol you make matzah balls out of this matzah, so it's no longer tam matzah that's a problem. You eat the matzah balls on Shabbos HaGodol, you don't get rid of it. In Rabbi Broin's guide, he brings that it's already written, he found in Kadmoinim that they would burn it on Erev Pesach. You don't have to cook it. You could burn it, mevayir it with the chametz, the matzah of Erev Tavshil, of Erev Chatzeres, you could mevayir it together with the chametz. And that was the old minhag, and that's how you take care of it from Erev Pesach to Erev Pesach. And then comes the next year, you have the same thing, and you have a fresh matzah every year. Now, today also, we don't go with the idea that we collect flour from each person. Rather, one person is mezakeh, is zoiche for all the people that are in the building, in the bungalow colony, in the chatzar. The way it's done is that one person is mezakeh, the other person is zoiche. To be able, you cannot be zoiche by yourself from something that belongs to you for other people. It has to go through a third party. So if I'm the one who's going to be mezakeh the Eruv for everybody else, so I will give it to somebody else, and that person will pick it up a tefach, and with that I tell him that he should be zoiche with this matzah for all the people that are in the chatzar. And the Rashba adds, you should make sure to have in mind and say that you're zoiche not only for the people that are here now, but for anybody who's going to move into this property later. And the Alter Rebbe brings that Yashayim, but you don't have to, because today already left Bezdin Masna. Everybody knows that, and it includes also people that are going to come. But if you look in the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe writes that you should say that you should have in mind to be zoiche for all the people that will be coming into the property afterwards. Then Alter Rebbe, if Yud Gimel, brings a whole machlekes, who could be zoiche, and there's two main kavim, is somebody who is eating by you, or somebody who is part of your family but is not eating by you. And based on that is a differentiation. If you have one shitta is that if they're under bar mitzvah, even if they don't eat by you, you can't be mezakeh through them, and you can't be mezakeh through Eved Nachri because he is like your hand. But you could be mezakeh through B'nai Ubitei Hagdolim, even if they do eat by you, because they are independent people, and also through your wife, even if she's still Ma'aseh Yodeh L'Bayla. And there's a whole different, there's the other Yeshayim that it doesn't work like that. Rather, it depends on Smuchim al Shulchan or not. So therefore, B'nai, even if he's a Gadol, you can't be mezakeh through him, even if he's not Samuch, if they are Samuch al Shulchan. And Bita, even if she's not Samuch al Shulchan, not through the wife, but yes, through an underage boy who is not Samuch al Shulchan. And Alter Rebbe then concludes, you should be machmer like both shittas if you're able to, and if you're not able to be machmer according to both shittas when it comes to bnei katan or these kinds of things, then you should rely on the first opinion, not on the Yeshayim, because that is the ikar. What happens if you forget to do it, but you're all sitting down, everybody's sitting down in the same place to eat a meal? So the bread that's in the middle of the table over there, that is considered like the Eruv for everybody else. And Alter Rebbe concludes in the end of the Siman, there's also a quote from the Shulchan Aruch, Mitzvah l'chazer achar Eruv l'achzer achar Eruv chatzeres. It's a mitzvah to do Eruv chatzeres, so people should not be metaltal be'isur. Very simple thing, if everybody's in the same chatzar, it's a closed area, and people will, without realizing, they will carry, and therefore it is a mitzvah to do Eruv chatzeres. The same thing applies, the same thing you will see in Siman Shin Tzadik Hey, that's mitzvah l'chazer achar shitufei mevayos. For a mavoi to do the same thing also. But missing is, there is nowhere where it says that it's a mitzvah to be lachzer achar Eirovei ayoris. To make a Eruv in the whole city, there is no such a mitzvah. It doesn't say that there's a mitzvah to be mechazer achar Eirovei ayoris. And that is obviously a point of contention in all the political wars, that whether this is how to apply this. Interestingly, if you look at the Rebbe's letters, you could understand them both ways. And that we're going to discuss now for the next few minutes. As usual, that the reason why there is so much, every time the topic of an Eruv in a city comes up, it creates such controversy, is because the sources could be understood in 2 or 3 or 4 ways. So when it comes to...
The box next to the Mefurish.
About what?
The box in Mefurish, it's a mitzvah.
For Ayoris. For Ayoris. No, for I'm saying, the Alter Rebbe writes for Mevoyes and for Chatzeres it's a mitzvah. But not for cities, the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention it. And even more so, when you look about a Ir, the halacha is that you have to make a shiur. You have to leave one place in the city, not out of the whole city, so they shouldn't forget Bechlal Teres Eitzah. Now, when you look, there are in your book of letters from the Rebbe, there is the first letter that was to Rabbi Eisenstadt, who did the Eruv in Manhattan. So the last ha'ara that the Rebbe writes to him is Be'inyan shemitzvah l'sakin Eiruvin, regarding the concept of the mitzvah to masakin Eiruvin. The Rebbe says that look in the Gemara Eiruvin Chavches, Tur Shulchan Aruch Oira Chaim Siman Shin Samach Vav Sif Yud Gimel, which is the same thing as Sif Yud Ches and Alter Rebbe mitzvah lachzer achar Eiruvei Chatzeres Shtem Mekubetzes Beitza Shas Tzuras Harash, the Rashbatz Chasam Sefer, and the Tashbetz Chasam Sefer, and the Shas Tshuvas base of Tanyana. The same 5 Maramekremes are also in this is in page 136, 137 in your book. The next letter to Rabbi Mashkovich, who also later did the Eruv in Manhattan, same Maramekremes are listed. What is written in these Maramekremes? It's interesting to look at it. In the Tshuvas of the Rosh. Yeah, and so now, if you look in the Mechaber, it's talking about what we and the Alter Rebbe, it's talking about Eruv Chatzeres. Right? If you're looking in the Rosh, he says about Heter Mevoyes with the Tzuras HaPesach. He's talking about Mevoyes. If you look in the Tashbetz, he says the Lashon is there's no issue, there's no Aveda in Tikkun Mevoyes. Again, Tikkun Mevoyes. If you look in the Chasam Sofer, it's talking about Sakin Mevoyes Eichem, to do a Tikkun of Mevoyes. And then at the end of the Tshuva, Mechuyev L'Sakin HaChatzerim V'HaMevoyes. Chatzer and Mavoi, again doesn't discuss the city. But when you look in the base of Tanyana, Siman Aleph, Seif, Anaf Zayin, over there he quotes all these people, and he also, what he does is he says, he's writing against the people that were against making native. But you look at all these sources, they're all Chatzeres Mevoyes, none of them discuss a city. So the Rebbe's letter was written to somebody who made an Eruv in a city. So when you look at it, there's 2 ways of understanding it. Either you could say, base of is a long tshuva about the Mumar, and the Anaf Zayin discusses whether it's a mitzvah to make an Eruv or not. And he explains why it's a mitzvah to save people who are, since he's discussing Mumarim and people who are Chaitim, so he explains why it's a mitzvah to make an Eruv to prevent the people from carrying Be'isur, and it's not and you can't say Halitei L'Rosh V'Yamus when it comes to these kinds of things, to carrying on Shabbos. So the Rebbe brings all these sources in both letters about Eruvin. So if you look at it, you could look at it both ways. Number one, you could say, well, the Rebbe is writing these letters to somebody who was building an Eruv in the city. The fact is the Rebbe recorded all these things as Inyan mitzvah l'sakin Íruvin. He's telling you all these things, and the Rebbe understands. The Rebbe wants to apply the same mitzvah that applies in Mevoyes and Chatzeres to the city. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is Mukfakir. The fact is, this guy is saying it's a mitzvah l'sakin Íruvin, and the Rebbe is telling him, hey, you think mitzvah l'sakin Íruvin, it doesn't apply because every single source is not talking about a city. It's talking about Chatzeres and Mevoyes. All right, so you could look at it both ways. Or you could continue on what the Rebbe wrote 20 years later, in Toshin Mem Beis, 25 years later. That's the letter to Rabbi Zinner. That is in page 153. Over there, the Rebbe goes and quotes both. The Rebbe says, B'negea le'Íruvin, you're doing Beis Ksavos, two extremes. Number one, mitzvah lachzar, chulu mevarech alav. These are all the sources that we saw. It's a mitzvah to make it, an Círuv. And what's the mitzvah lachzar, rachar levarech alav? That's talking in the two places where it says mitzvah is mevoyes and chatzeres. Uleidach, afilu b'det tzadik k'poshut, tzarich liyas shir shalei tishtakach. You have to have the shir that you shouldn't forget. And where does that applies to? That applies to a city. So you have the two extremes. The Rebbe doesn't take a position on this. And he says, therefore the Rebbe says, Finis daiti al harabonim hayodim tnai hamokim lahachlit ma machriya b'mokim pleni la'aseh eloi. Let the Rabbanim of town decide whether you will apply the mitzvah lachzar achar Círuv chatzeres and how to apply it in a specific place. Whether you're going to do the whole city, you're going to do part of the city, you're going to do some of them or not. Or you're going to focus more on the la'aseh shiur shaloi tishtakach teiras Círuv. So, if you're going to look at it, you can't prove one way or the other way, because yes, you could understand from the Rebbe's quoting these letters, you could understand it one way or the other. But when you look later, when the Rebbe discussed to somebody who actually was planning on it, the Rebbe says, you have both options. If you're looking at mitzvah, that applies in one sometimes you have to apply mitzvah lachzer achar Círuv chatzeres and shituf mevoyes. Sometimes you have to be careful with shir shalei tishtakach. Sometimes you have to have a combination of both. Yeah, the Rebbe doesn't say you have to have a combination of both, or sometimes that's the thing. And that's why it's not something which you could make a general rule on it. Rather, the Rabbanim hayodim tnai hamokim, the rabbis who know how the place looks, they should be the ones to determine tnai hamokim, not how the place looks, how the place, the conditions of the place, the actual composition of the community of the place and everything else. They should decide whether you're going to do it as a mitzvah to make an Círuv, or whether you have to focus on the shir shaloi tishtakach. The chatchila is that the Rabbanim hayodim tnai hamokim should decide. That's the chatchila. I can't tell you what's Rabbanim. Everything has to be Rabbanim, has to be yodim, and tnai hamokim. I didn't say local. I said the Rabbanim will know the place Tnai hamokim. If it's not a local rabbi, how does he know Tnai hamokim? That's if you only look at the technical. Tnai hamokim could mean a lot of things. It could mean the technical topography. Do you know Tnai hamokim is, it's not tzuras hamokim. That's tzuras hamokim would mean, do you know if there's a bridge or not? That you look in Google Maps and every dove becomes the Tnai hamokim. Tnai hamokim is the conditions of the place. You have to understand what the situation. And what does Tnai hamokim have to do with shir shaloi tishtakach? Shir shaloi tishtakach obviously means that it has to do with understanding the people, not only the mountains and the valleys and the bridges and the streets. It obviously refers to the people. Because there's no shir. The idea of shir shaloi tishtakach is not a concept that applies to a bridge. We're not worried that a bridge is going to forget about Hilchos Shabbos. We're worried about the people are going to forget about Hilchos Shabbos. So, good. So every location is different. Every place is its own din. What I'm saying is you can't make a klal. You can't say one way or the other way clearly without any sfeikus. You could say that every place has its own din, every situation has its own din, and you can't say that Rebbe says it's 100% a mitzvah, and you can't say that Rebbe says it's 100% a neveda. You could go both ways. Every place is different. No place is the same, no situation is the same, no year is the same, no location is the same, no community is the same. Things change, the city changes, people change, the rabbis change, the Tnai HaMokim change, the Tnoim of the Mokim Mekaymis around it also change. It's into consideration. You make a psak, you can't make a psak based on a small set of information or based on things that change. Even if you have an Eruv which is built in a specific, you could look at maps. You could say a person, I want to make an Eruv in the city of Varsha. Why? Because I opened the Shas Chuvas from the 1920s and I see how he explains how to do why it's kosher. The Nazis bombed the whole place. And the bridges that were there are no longer there, and the buildings that were there were no longer there, and the parks that were there were no longer there, and everything is not the same. So things change. So you can't say based on one thing that you read, you're going to decide. Things change, and that's why you have to be Yodet Tnai HaMokim. You have to be a Rav who knows the place, and we'll make a determination for each place based on what is needed for that place, for those people, and for everything else. But there's nothing in this matter that is black and white. And with that I conclude.